Hello and welcome to another edition of Turned Out a Punk. I'm your host, Damian Abraham, and once again, I'm bringing you a conversation with someone who grew up listening to punk, may or may not still be involved with punk, but had their life changed by the genre in a major way. And today on the show, someone I have majorly wanted to talk to for years, from the band Youth of Today, from the band Judge, from the band Shelter, from the band Bold, from the band Gorilla Biscuits, from the band Project X, from the band Values Here, from the I could go on forever with this. John Porcell is on the show, also known as Paramonda Das, also known as simply Porcell, and just a legend. I am very excited about this one. You'll hear more about it in 1 second, but first, if you want to get in touch with me or the show, head over to the email address, turnedoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com. That is run by my brother and show producer and guest booker extraordinaire, Tristan Abraham. Thank you, Tristan, for all the hard work you do for this podcast, and he will get the message to me. You can also find me occasionally on Twitter or Instagram, mainly Instagram, but even that's not that often these days. At Left for Damian. There is a Turned Out a Punk Instagram page, and a Turned Out a Punk Facebook page, and a Turned Out a Punk YouTube page, and a Turned Out a Punk TikTok page. All of those can be found at Turned Out a Punk on those platforms, and there are videos that I put together. I really love making those videos, and I post those things on those platforms, and you can check them out, when you get time. Speaking of checking things out, I play in a band. We are called Fucked Up. We are currently laying a little low because last year we put out like I don't know, 10 records or something insane, like a bunch of full lengths and some singles, and we got more stuff coming out. You can find out more information about this band over at fuckedup.cc. And we're not going to be playing live anytime soon. We got a show in March, but you're probably not going to be around for it. It's going to be very far. Not for everybody. There are definitely some people that live where we're going. But anyway, I'm not going to get into it now. You can find out more information about that show, though, when it does get announced over at fuckedup.cc. We are laying pretty low these days, and I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying not being on stage. Whew, feels good. Feels good just to be in my basement for a while. But enough about me. On to today's show. As I said off the top, today on the show, Porcell is here. This is someone who I also said off the top I've wanted to talk to for years, played in so many unbelievably legendary bands, one of the architects of what would become known as sort of like, I guess, youth crew, which is a music genre or subgenre, I guess, or subgenre that I love deeply. So get ready for some nerdy conversation with Porcell. You can find out more information about all of his various projects over on the description for this podcast. I'm going to have links to different things, but in 2025, in April, Shelter will be going on a massive tour of Europe, and Judge has also announced that they're going to be playing some shows in March in Florida, and they've also got in some shows in New Jersey before that, a show on March 2nd in New Jersey before that. You can find out all this stuff below in those links right there. Check out all the stuff that Porcell does in terms of music, because they are all foundational bands, like just some of the greatest hardcore ever. Also, Porcell does a sort of like weekly yoga class, and you can find out more information on his Instagram, the Hardcore Yogi. I will have a link to that as well in the description below. And that is it. I'm not going to ramble on anymore. Sit back, relax, and enjoy Slam, a.k.a. Porcell, on Turned Out a Punk. John, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's an honor to be here, brother. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, as I told you off air and in text before this, I have been waiting like 30 years to have this conversation with you. So I apologize in advance for the punishment.
Punish away. I'm fully excited for it.
Well, there's a lot of places I want to go with it, but I guess the best way to start with it is how'd you get into punk, John? Do you remember the first time you ever came across it?
I got into punk very young. I came across it. Uh, I when I was a kid, I was super into music, but I was really into, I was into Kiss. And Kiss was sort of the be all end all of music for me. When you're like 9, 10 years old and the bass player's breathing fire and spitting blood and the guitar player's got a smoking guitar, it's just like it totally just grabs you. But I think around that, so from the time I was like 7 to probably like 11, I was just obsessed with Kiss. And then I was in like sixth grade. I was about to go into junior high school, and I had sort of grown out of Kiss. And I was thinking, like, what kind of music am I going to get into besides Kiss? And I started, going into more like classic rock stuff. I was getting into Black Sabbath and Alice Cooper and things like that. But I was actively searching out, trying to find new music. And I remember one person had given me the Devo record, one of the Devo records. And it was just so fresh and so new and so cool, like that first Devo record. And I was like, wow, there is a whole world of music out there besides Kiss and classic rock. And, I got to really search this out. So, this is like before the internet. This is before cell phones. This is before Google. It was hard to find new music, especially if you were a little kid with no money. And, you could only really borrow records from other people. So there was this one, I had one friend in the neighborhood, and his brother was kind of into new wave music. Um, and it was from him that I got the from his older brother that I got the Sex Pistols "Nevermind the Bollocks" record. And man, it was just such a great record. From the time that I put that needle on that first track, I was like, you ever get that where you're like, this is what I'm looking for. This is exactly what I'm looking for. It was so, you know, angry and rebellious and kind of like outsider music and a little dangerous. It was everything that I was looking for in one record. Even the way that the guys looked, and the bass player was named Sid Vicious. It just kind of like, it was the new thing that reached out and grabbed me. So it was really that first Sex Pistols record that started my whole downward spiral into, blowing off college, blowing off the mainstream, and sitting in the back of a van for decades on end.
That Nevermind the Bollocks is really kind of the anti-Kiss in a lot of ways. Like his Kiss is like all sort of facade. They're letting you kind of painfully at times, certainly in the case of Sid Vicious, behind the curtain and showing you what, they're really like as people, even though they're amped up in the same sort of way.
Yeah, exactly. It was real music. It was real music about it was like kids, they were young, they were basically kids talking about real stuff that affected their life. And after listening to, Love Gun and Kiss just doesn't really mean anything, and I loved ACDC. Their songs don't mean anything. You know what I mean? It's just kind of like good old time rock and roll music. So when you hear something real, then it's like, wow, and I think it's not even necessarily, punk has the monopoly on that. You could listen to like Bob Marley and be like, wow, this is real. You know what I mean? So I think I was just searching for that kind of music that really just spoke to things that were happening in my life. Even if it was just like things are wrong, I can't really say what it is, but I'm just feeling a whole lot of angst right now. And that's how I felt when the Sex Pistols came into my life.
It's interesting though with Devo and ACDC, and I guess Bob Marley too. Like they are kind of all in the punk universe. Like I think Mark from Devo was on the podcast, and I think he really does consider Devo kind of on some level a punk band. And ACDC, weirdly, there's a flyer I saw when I was in Australia for an ACDC 1976 tour, which says 100% punk rock. And as much as they are like weird and fantastical in a way the Sex Pistols aren't, they also are really rejecting sort of the rock star Kiss mold, or like at least harkening back to like more roots of rock and roll. In Devo in a weird way, like in a very kind of out there space age kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, Devo to me was definitely punk rock. It wasn't the stuff that you were listening to on the radio, during the early '80s, which was mostly just disco, and pop music. So they were so far removed from it. The only thing that the only category I had for it back then was punk. I mean, now technically you could look at it, you could say it's new wave or whatever. But to me, it was total outsider music that nobody in my school could wrap their heads around, except for me and a few other outsider kids.
Well, yeah, you mentioned, the other outsider kids. Like, how many kids around you were into punk at that time? Like, you grew up in like Westchester, right? I believe.
Yeah, barely any, barely any. And this is, when you look at the early '80s, even in New York City, the punk scene was very small. I mean, I was just, we just played a show. Judge just played a show in Holland with a big festival show at Agnostic Front also played. So I was talking with Roger, and Roger was like, "Yeah, it was, the whole entire New York City punk scene was me and about 30 other people, and we all knew each other. We were all friends. Like that was the New York City punk scene in like 1982. 30 people.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a huge thing back then. And especially in Westchester, there was maybe just a few other kids in my school there was probably maybe one or two kids that were like, yeah, I'm a punk rocker. And there was maybe like three kids that were sort of just curious about it. But yeah, it was barely anybody. I remember I went to, they have these like fairs, like these carnivals in the suburbs, and everybody goes. It's just something that's like fun to do in the summer. And I was at this carnival, and I looked and I saw a kid with a leather jacket, and he was probably like a half a mile away. And I was like, "Oh my God, punk rocker!" And I ran as fast as I could, like as furiously as I could. I caught up to him, put my head on his shoulder. Oh my God, are you at the punk? What band's she like? Oh my God, it's so cool to meet you, brother. It was just like it was like that. Finding another person that was into the crazy music that you were into was like finding a needle in a haystack. And so it was very, very, very small.
Were there any local Westchester kind of like first or second wave punk bands? I was trying to think of them before we
No,
talked today.
the closest thing to punk to my high school is that you ever heard of that band Ultravox?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so this was the very first singer of Ultravox. They kind of got bigger and they became more of like a popular new wave band when they had their second singer. But their first singer, I think he sang on maybe just the first record. I'm not sure. He went to my high school. Him and his sister went to my high school. They were like older kids. And I love that first Ultravox record. That was the closest kind of punk rock adjacent thing that ever happened in my high school. There was no bands. Actually, the only other band was, I was in a band called the Young Republicans. We were the only punk band in the whole entire school, maybe even the whole, surrounding schools also. But that band Bold, from my school, when I was in high school, they were in junior high school. And so they went to the same school as me.
And they were in Crippled Youth, I guess, shortly thereafter, right?
Well,
Pre-Bold.
they were originally called Crippled Youth, and then they became Bold. When I met them, they were in Crippled Youth.
So I guess like how did the Young Republicans come together? Like where were you hearing about punk rock stuff other than, this new wave older brother friend?
I was so lucky because WNYU had a punk rock radio show called Noise the Show, and it was incredible. It was incredible. This guy, Tim Sommer from that band, Even Worse, was the DJ. He was like this crazy DJ. He screamed the whole entire time. But I could pick it up in Westchester. It was on like every Wednesday or something at like 10 o'clock. And I used to tape it every week. And every week, this is like 19, I think he first started the show in like 1982, maybe, or something like that. Maybe even 1981. And every week it was like getting a college degree in punk rock. He'd play Bad Brains, Circle Jerks, New York Thrash compilation, the Beastie Boys, SSD, Minor Threat. I remember the first time I heard Minor Threat was on his show, and I'll never forget it. It had such a huge. The first time I heard SSD was on his show too. They played the song "Under the Influence," and I listened to it, and I was like, is this even music? Like I couldn't even figure it out. Some of my favorite records were the first time you listen to it, you're like, I don't even know if I like this, but there's something compelling about it, so I'm going to keep listening to it. Like Gang of Four was like that for me. You know, I could barely wrap my head around it, and then I listened to it more and more and more, and then they became, one of my favorite bands. So SSD was like that. I heard them, and the song was like, have you ever heard that song, Under the
Oh
Influence? Like it
God,
does.
absolutely.
Yeah, it's like it's so chaotic. You can't even barely tell where the beat is. Um, and that was big on me because SSD became one of my, soon after that, SSD became one of my favorite bands.
It's interesting when you try and look at like where the distinction point happens between punk and hardcore, and like obviously it's all punk, but I mean like the sonic break, and it really is SSD. And when Al was on the podcast, he talked about, he wanted a band that was purely influenced by hardcore bands. Like he kind of hated punk. And I guess also John Brannon too talks about how he really didn't like sort of the local punk scene, but John loved that British punk stuff. Whereas I think Al with SSD wanted it to be influenced by Black Flag and Minor Threat, and it was not influenced by any sort of precursor to that. So it was like sort of this complete rejection of melody and everything you would try and do to make a song prior to hardcore.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that too because uh, when I got into the Sex Pistols, then I just kind of tumbled into the Ramones, the Clash, the Weirdos, Stiff Little Fingers, X-Ray Specs, all that kind of stuff. And I would go out and I would and I had all those records, and I started collecting records almost immediately after I got that Sex Pistols record. So, and all that stuff is very melodic. Yeah, it would be pop music. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Uh, and I remember the day that I went from punk rock to hardcore. And that was the day that I walked into the record store and I was just like, and usually back then I didn't know anything. So I would just flip through the records. I would take the train down to New York City and I would go to like Bleecker Bob's and there was 99 Records and Free Being Records. There was a few record stores in Greenwich Village that I would go and I had a paper route and I would get my paper route money and I would get on the train to New York City and I would get on the train and I would hide in the bathroom because I didn't want to pay for a ticket because I wanted like the price that I would pay for a ticket, I could get another record for.
Oh, that's a single easy.
Yeah. So I was that into it that I would just like stow away on the train because I wanted to have more record money. And I would go there and I'd buy punk records. And I remember that fateful day that I'm just looking through the punk albums at Bleecker Bob's. And there it is, Black Flag Damaged. And like when you see that cover, you have to buy it. Pass up that record cover. And so I brought it home, and that was hardcore. That didn't sound like the Clash. That didn't sound like the Ramones. This was something that was totally different, and I loved it. I loved it. It was just like, I was a pretty like hyper kid. Now, if I was born nowadays the way that I was then, they would have me on Ritalin and like everything because I was just like a hyper kid skateboarding, like doing everything. And when I heard Black Flag, and it was so fat, like even the first track, Rise Above, it was like that was another earth shattering moment for me. And then that's when I went from punk rock into hardcore. Which brings me to another big record that had a big impact on me. Like I was listening to Noise the Show. Originally, it was called Oi the Show. When I started listening to it, it was called Oi the Show. But they would play a lot of Oi, and that's how I got into like Cockney Rejects and Angelic Upstarts, and I loved all that stuff too. But he was like, "Here we go, Minor Threat," and he played the song "In My Eyes." And that was such a defining moment for me because not only is the music just so powerful, but the lyrics, like they grabbed me so much because I think I was probably still drinking at the time. This was like, I think I heard that song when I was like maybe 15, but I really didn't like to drink. I didn't like smoke. I hated smoking pot, but it was just something that you did in school for like status. You know, if you wanted to be cool at school, you had to go to the parties, you had to get drunk, and you had to walk around with a beer in your hand. And if you didn't, you were a nerd and you were kind of socially ostracized. So I would drink, but I didn't like it. And so the first kind of like straight edge anthem that I heard was that song "In My Eyes." You tell me you like the taste, you just think it
Yeah.
looks cool. I was like, wow,
Yeah.
and even like the whole song, it was such a rejection of everything that I hated about high school that I was like, oh my God, I have to get these Minor Threat records. And so I went to next weekend I went and I only had I bought the Misfits Beware. I only had enough money for the Misfits Beware, and one other single. And I had both Minor Threat singles. I was like, which one should I buy? And I actually bought the second one first because it had that song "In My Eyes" on it. So the first Minor Threat record I got in was actually their second single, and then quickly after that, I went back and got the first single because it was so awesome.
Arguably, the second single is the better of the two.
I think so.
Like even with the SSD record, like a lot of times people are like, "Oh, the first record's the most raging," but I think SSD is the same way. That second LP is really where it gets crazy.
To me, "Get It Away" is one of the kings of records. I loved "The Kids Will Have Their Say," but I think like "Get It Away" is sort of like their London calling. Like that's the record that really just like defined them. You know?
Yeah, 100%. What about like because ultimately you guys start playing in Connecticut or you start going to Connecticut. Ultimately you play in Violent Children, but how much awareness did you have kind of beforehand of like that reflex of pain, CIA scene or even the Incus record scene kind of before that with like Miracle
I
Legion,
was t- I was I was 100% completely immersed in that scene. Like when I started going to shows of the Anthrax, this was when the Anthrax was in Stamford, and all those bands were just kind of starting. So, Vatican Commandos were one of the first bands I really loved, and it was cool because the guitar player was Moby.
Yeah.
Moby was always so cool. I remember even thinking, like, even back then, like, oh, this guy Moby is so freaking cool. He just looked cool, and I don't know, the guy was just like, he just had that kind of James Dean swagger about him, where you're like, this is the coolest guy in the Connecticut hardcore scene.
It's funny because he
Uh,
gets kicked out of the band right by the second 7 inch, but then the art for the second 7 inch is done by Rob Zombie.
Yeah, yeah, they were down with Rob Zombie. I never knew that. I don't know if Rob Zombie ever came to the Anthrax or if he was. I don't remember him coming to shows, but maybe he did. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it would have been White Zombie would have been a little bit later, and that would have been New York, right? I guess they met in college, maybe art school or something. He knew someone from
Yeah,
the band.
maybe. There was a huge connection between that Connecticut scene and art because the Anthrax was actually an art gallery, and the owners of it were artists, and passionately put on art shows as they did hardcore shows. So there was a real crossover over of art and that early Connecticut scene.
Did Young Republicans play with any of this sort of
Oh,
Connecticut
oh
bands?
yeah, yeah. We used to play
Who
the Anthrax all the time.
who are some of the bands that you guys would play with? Like, was it more with sort of like the hardcore stuff around that time, or were you kind of crossing over with bands like Miracle Legion?
No, we played the hardcore shows.
Okay, that
We
makes more
played
sense.
with who did we play with? God, we played a bunch. We would play any show. We played with uh, oh God, what is that great band from Boston that Jay Mascis played in?
Deep Wound.
Deep Wound. We played
Oh,
with Deep Wound. We played with Deep Wound in the Outpatients. We
that's
played
fucking
just.
awesome. What was that show like?
Oh my God! I have you ever seen that band, the Outpatients? They were incredible.
I've seen footage, obviously, but never got to
Yeah,
see them live. But oh,
yeah.
both those
Deep,
bands are killer.
yeah. Deep Wound were great. Then we played with a bunch of bands that were on that Big City compilation.
I was going to bring that label up, right? Because they did the Connecticut is Fun compilation later on, but they did a lot of early Connecticut records, or Connecticut bands were at least appearing on a lot of compilations they put out.
Yeah, Violent Children was on one of their compilations, and so there was a bunch of bands that used to they used to have like big city shows. I forget which bands. God, if I could see the comp, I would tell you. But really, the kind of like really punk bands.
Ultraviolence,
Um,
I guess, would have been one of them. Even worse,
it
I guess, was
wasn't
on the label.
it wasn't Ultraviolence or even worse. Although I saw them many times at the Anthrax. Even worse used to play there all the time.
Given that you're a record collector, were you familiar with Abuse? Because I guess they would have been like one of the few sort of straight edge leaning bands from that, like
The
New York.
Abuse the Abuse played the Anthrax, and I loved them. This was another great story. So we were doing the Young Republicans when I was in like eighth grade, but our singer and our drummer weren't really into hardcore. The singer was sort of like a very artsy sort of guy, but he would wear like ties and stuff to school. Like he was more of like a art guy, like new romantic guy or whatever you might want to call it. You know, into like Echo and the Bunnymen and stuff like that, more than like Minor Threat. I don't think he even liked those bands. And our drummer, like, I don't know, I think he was kind of liked hanging out with us, so he would play with us. But you know, the singer quit, still wanted to do the band. So we were looking for singers, but there was no other punk rockers in the school. And so somebody said, there's a kid that just started going to North Salem High School and he's into punk. You should get him to sing. And I was like, what? There's a punk rock kid. And he moved to North Salem from New York City. You should get him to sing. And I was like, oh my God. And it's so funny because North Salem High School has another interesting history of punk rock. And all the punk rockers that were in that school, they all got kicked out of the school, like every single one of them. Like, what's his name? The guitar player for the Plasmatics. What's his name?
Oh fuck yeah. Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Absolutely.
I Richie Stotts. So Richie Stotts. I believe Wendy O. Williams actually went to North Salem High School also.
Oh, wild.
Yeah, Wendy O. Williams and Richie Stotts. They went to North Salem High School. DJ Dimitri from D Light. Remember that band D Light?
Yes,
They weren't punk,
absolutely.
but he went there. Um, Gavin in Absolution.
Yeah, that's
He
fucking
went there.
awesome.
He also got kicked out. Everybody got kicked out. All the punk rockers got kicked out. And this guy Sam, who sang for the Young Republicans, he also went there and also got kicked out. And he was a skinhead that moved from New York City. And so we didn't know what he looked like. I remember me and Graham, who was the bass player for Young Republicans, who was also super into hardcore. He used to also go to all the shows of the Anthrax. We went to North Salem High School and we left school early and we got there when school was coming out. And we literally just parked in front of North Salem High School and just like looked for people to come out. We're like hoping we're going to see a punk rocker. So we're sitting there waiting. Everybody's pouring out of the school. And then out walks this guy, Sam. Boots, braces, Doc Martens, shaved head. We're like, there's our guy. There's our guy. So we went running up to him and we were just like, oh, and and even for him, he's going to this high school with no other punk rockers in high school. He was so glad to see us. And so we started hanging out with him. And he was good friends with this guy named Wampum, who was really good friends with Murphy's Law. And like he was in that whole agnostic front. Like, and this is like, I think United Blood had just come out. Like this is pretty early on.
Yeah.
And even if you look at all the old, he was the guy that drew a lot of those early New York hardcore flyers. Like you ever see that New York hardcore flyer where it's like it's an AF flyer and it's a big AF,
yeah, with all the
and then it's got
skinheads
a bunch of
moshing.
people. Yeah, he
Wow.
drew that flyer. This guy
Wow.
Wampum drew the
Yeah,
flyer.
I know exactly.
And so he also, like, if you ever see early Murphy's Law pictures, the bass player Russell has a strap and it says Wampum down the strap. He was a graffiti writer and he was an artist, and it said Wampum on his strap. He was really good friends with this guy Sam, and so he used to come to Sam's house and hang out with us, and he was like our connection to New York hardcore. And so was Sam. Like Sam was like, oh yeah, CBGBs. I saw that he really loved like the Young and the Useless and the Beastie Boys. Like, this is way before the Beastie Boys were a rap band. And so he had all those records. And I remember one time Wampum came down. Wampum came down and it was like, heard of Cause for Alarm? And I was like, no. He was like, what? He's like, have you heard of the Mob? I was like, no. And he was like, oh my God, next time I come down, I'm going to school you guys. So he came down and he brought United Blood, Antidote 7-inch, Cause for Alarm, The Abused, and The Mob. And so he was like, okay. And these were records that had just kind of come out. Like the only really New York hardcore bands I knew at that time were probably Kraut. They used to play Kraut all the time on Noise the Show. So I knew of Kraut, but I didn't really know of all these other kind of. I knew the New York thrash compilation. So I knew like False Prophets, Beastie Boys, all those kind of bands that were on the the Undead and things like that. But I never heard of this new kind of burgeoning hardcore, New York hardcore sound scene. So I remember, oh my God, he played those records. Those 4 records, Blood, Alarm, The Abused, and Antidote, instantly became my favorite records. Those records are so mighty and so awesome. Oh, and there was also Urban Waste. Brought Urban Waste. Those 5 records, I quite honestly, I like the Mob much less, but those 5 records were like, they started a new era for me. They were just so incredible, those records. Oh my God, I just love them. And so yeah, that was another big turning point in my musical taste, was Wampum bringing those New York hardcore records down to up to Westchester.
Well, like you're saying, outside of the New York thrash tape, like that stuff, there's like so few of those pressed in those first pressing runs of all those 7-inches. And it wasn't like Discord, where it seems like Discord right away kind of like had the machine set up to kind of like do multiple pressings of some of these 7-inches. So they did get around. They're obscure and they're hard to find. But like those New York things are like, until the internet, impossible to find. And that's with the bootleg culture.
Yeah, it's true. And even those bands, it wasn't like they were big bands that were on that New York thrash compilation. They were all just kind of tiny bands from New York.
Yeah, but it's weird how that's defined New York hardcore in a lot of ways to people, because that tape was still like, but even when I was getting into going to shows and buying these records, that was like one of the first CDs you could find that was like, oh, New York hardcore. And then you're listening to it, you're like, oh, this is weird. And then later on, your Antidote, you're like, oh, I get it a lot more now.
To me, that wasn't the beginning of New York hardcore. To me, the beginning of New York hardcore was Agnostic Front, United Blood, The Abused, Antidote, Cause for Alarm, and Urban Waste. Because that was the prototype of the sound that now we know of as New York hardcore. You know, that real, just kind of like rough, hard sound that came later, you know, Cro-Mags, Sick of It All, you know, Madball, Agnostic Front. You know, that's what people really equate with New York hardcore. That New York Trash compilation was almost like a little arty, you know,
Well,
a
it's
little punk.
interesting. Well, sorry, once again, didn't mean to cut you off, but it's interesting doing this show, talking to people around then, like the impact DC and then Boston coming in, being super hard, super violent at times, kind of like this, punk scene where all these kids, there's like homeless kids there, but it was artier, it was punkier, it was like a little more kind of like hippie dippy kind of vibe. And I don't mean that in any sort of derogatory way, but it gets harder a little bit later. And when it gets harder, it gets so much harder than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was the stamp that New York put on New York hardcore, the really hard hardcore, like, you know, from the streets for the streets kind of thing. Um, and that was a really cool sound too.
You brought up earlier that were into record collecting super early, and there's this sort of legendary pressing of Can't Close My Eyes that showed up in Toronto, I guess, late 80s. It shows up, and there's blank labels on one side of the 7 inch, and on it, there's like, on some pressings, there was like Ray's favorite punk bands. On some, it was Porcell's favorite punk bands. On some, it was Ray's favorite hardcore bands, Porcell's favorite hardcore bands. And it was like you guys listing off your favorite hardcore 7 inches. And I wish to this day that I'd taken photographs when these things were kind of floating around in the early days of eBay. But it was awesome, the stuff you guys were into. And like there's a real sort of like record digger kind of vibe to things super early on, it would seem, with you guys.
Yeah, we love that stuff. I remember when we got the idea because it was funny because I just saw John Brannon, my new band, played a show with them in Mexico City, a big festival show. And I was like, when I had my first Negative Approach record, the cover was black and white, but someone had took a yellow highlighter and highlighted the Negative Approach. And then all on the inside, it was glue, but you could look on the inside. It was all this just like weird writing. And I was asking John Brandon about that. He was like, "Oh yeah, we did that because we glued them ourselves, so we just write crazy stuff on them." And we had these highlighters, and we only highlighted maybe like 50 of them or something like that. So it made the rare record because you would have some of them, and you would do kind of funky things to them. So we love that stuff. And I remember Ray. He used to collect records too. Like when we first moved to New York, we were super competitive about collecting records. And we would just scour every small record store from uptown to downtown looking for records. And I was always trying to like beat him to the new record store and stuff like that. So he managed to find, I think it was like two or three Bad Brains Pay to Come singles, which was like the holy grail of record collecting at that time. I think they only made, I don't know how many they made, but it was just maybe like 300 or something like that.
I think it's 500 for the
Uh,
first press with the sleeve, and then 1,000 with the tan labels without the sleeve
I don't think so.
of Pay
I
to
think
Come.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I
Maybe I'm wrong on that.
I think it was way less with the picture sleeve. I don't know. We can look it up. We
Okay,
can look it
go,
up.
go to
But this
Discogs.
was he had him with the tan label. He had him with the
Okay,
tan
yeah.
label. We had heard that there was a picture sleeve of that, but no one had ever even seen it. It was like a unicorn. We didn't even know what it looked like. But we had heard, oh yeah, there's a pick sleeve of that. I I, I remember I remember being told at the time that there was only 100 pick sleeves, and people were like, "You're never going to find that." There was only 100 of them, and so probably had more rare records than Ray, but he had these Bad Brain singles. And oh my God, would he hold them over my head? I was like, "Trade me some for me." He's like, "No way." There's no way, because if I give you one of these, then you're going to have this, and then you're going to have a better record collection than me. So, and then one time there was a record store that's called Bleecker Street Jazz. It was a jazz record store. And just for a laugh, I walked in there. I said, "Do you have any punk records?" And the guy said, "Hold on a second." And so he went in the back and like he's just going through stuff. I was there for like 20 minutes, and I could see he's pulling kind of 7 inches down, and he's putting me in a pile for me. And he says, "Here, this is what we have." And it was like the Knack. There was a few Devo 7 inches in there that were cool, but I had already had them. Just kind of stuff like that. It wasn't punk at all. It was sort of like new wave stuff at best. And I'm going through this pile, and I'm just like, oh God. And then I flip over like a Blondie record, and there it is. The Bad Brains Pay to Come with picture sleeve. And I was like, I couldn't even believe it. It was like I had unearthed like the Holy Grail. I'd never even seen it. I just sat there and just looked at it. You've seen it with like they're in a car and they don't have dreadlocks and they're just kind of and they're dressed sort of like Prince and they're like looking back behind the car. And I was just like, oh my God. And I was thinking to myself, and I sat there and I just looked at it for a minute, just geeking out on it. And the guy is sitting there right at the counter, and I'm thinking like, oh my God, he's going to think like this is a really rare record and I really want it. I better play it really cool. So I kind of shuffled the records a little bit, and I was like playing it really cool, and I was like, maybe I'll take this one. But the guy knew that like that was a record that I was staring at. And usually singles back then, like if you were just going to buy a regular single, it was like $2 or $3. And I said, how much for this one? He goes, $5. And it was almost like he's trying to like play hardball, like $5. And I pulled out a $5 out of my pocket. I was like, thank you very much, sir. So we were into like pick sleeves that were really hard to find, and all kinds of like cool written stuff on them, different labels, stuff like that. Because even like the United Blood record, the first pressing, it had the label with the skinhead going like
the
this,
eye, right?
Through the eye. Yeah. And that was hard to get. So we were into stuff like that. So when we put out the one that you're talking about, when we put out Can't Close My Eyes through Positive Force, which was 7 Seconds record label, Revelation at the time was really starting to take off. Like they had done the Warzone single and that New York Hardcore Comp single, the Together single.
Yeah.
And I believe maybe they had done Sick of It All or something like that. But there was really like hype generating around Revelation. And so Ray really wanted to repress the record on Revelation. So he kind of very gingerly called up Kevin Seconds and was like, hey, my record label is really taking off. And we would think, it's about, we need to repress Can't Close My Eyes anyway. Do you mind if we just repress it on Revelation? And Kevin Seconds was totally cool. He's like, no, not at all. Like, do your thing. Like, what my thing was. Like, that's how I started Positive Force. It was like my thing, and now you're doing your thing. I totally support you. And he said, he goes, I'll tell you what, I have one box left. I'll even just send you I'll even send you the box of the 7-inch. So he sent us maybe like, it was probably like 200 of those Can't Close My Eyes records. And they had blank labels. And so we just sat there and we wrote stuff. We put stickers on them. We were just looking around the apartment. Like I would just find something and I would tape it to the label and we would write. So we really just kind of like wrote a lot of stuff on those 200 copies. And it's kind of cool because people will come up and be like, hey, I have this Can't Close My Eyes single that I bought 30 years ago. It's got all this random stuff written on it. And it was mostly like inside jokes too. They were like, what does this mean? And it would just be some kind of like inside joke that only me and Ray would know. And I would look at it and I would laugh and I'd explain it to him. So yeah, so those are rare. Just Can't Close My Eyes that have stuff written all over.
Oh yeah, and it feels like a lot of the stuff that you guys did but rather by design or by accident, certainly with those blue and red wishing wells of the LP, where I guess they got lost, and I guess according to legend, a box of red ones showed up at a guy's house, and he nailed them to the side of his barn so he could look at what records looked like when they warped. That was always the story back then. What happened to the red
No,
pressing?
that's not the story. The story is there was very few pressed as it was of the red and the blue.
150, I think, or
And
something.
yeah, and Pat Dubar or Pat Longley, they had pickup trucks and they had some boxes of the records in the pickup truck and they bounced out of the pickup truck. That was the story that I heard. I never heard this story about the guy with the barn. I don't know if there's any truth to that whatsoever. Maybe he found them.
Yeah, I
But
think that's maybe the thing is that he found them, but either way, it's a colorful legend.
those were rare because I think they only pressed like 150 of each color, and supposedly like a couple of boxes got lost.
And then, but like with stuff like, Chunking can suck it. You guys must have known this is going to be a collector's item immediately.
We had no idea.
Really?
We had no idea, and Jordan like really had to talk us into that. People will just never know what life was like before cell phones. They just will not be able to know what life was from before cell phones. And even like to make a long distance call to like call California was super expensive. Like you had to spend like 10, $20 on one phone call to call California. So I remember uh we had originally recorded that record at Chungking and we were going to put it out and it was going to be on Revelation and they were all excited about it. I was completely bummed on the record because I hated the recording and I just thought like Judge is so much of a better band than this recording reflects. But I just kind of acquiesced to the fact that okay, these guys paid for it and the machine is in motion and what can I do? And I remember right before Youth in 1989, right before Youth Today left for that European tour. Literally, like I think it was like a few hours before, Mike called me up. Mike was like, "Hey, man, I really don't like how this record came out. We could do so much better. We should re-record this record." And at that time, we had written that song "Take Me Away," which we would play live, and everybody loved it. He was like, "We should re-record it. We should do Take Me Away. Um, we should put Take Me Away on it." And I really just hate how this record came out. Can you call Jordan and see if there's anything you can do? So I remember it's like hours before I'm leaving on this tour, and I called Jordan. I was like, "Look, Jordan, me and Mike really don't like this record. We hate it." And he was like, "Dude, it's plated." Like we've already made the plates for the record. Like this record is about to be pressed like tomorrow. We paid for everything. We even paid for the plating. That's the most expensive thing to pay for. And I was like, dude, we would really just love to re-record it. We don't like it. Is there anything you could do? And Jordan, to his credit, was like, oh my God. I've already invested thousands of dollars in this thing, but if you guys want to freaking re-record it, okay, re-record it, whatever. But he said, we already have it plated. Let's just do 100 of these things so I can just get my money back for the plating. Get my money back for the recording and the plating. We'll press 100. I know you guys don't like it, but we'll just press 100 just so I can get my money back. And so I said, okay. And that was right before I left. So it was sort of like just a way for Jordan to get his money back. It wasn't supposed to be some kind of crazy. It really wasn't meant to be a collector's. I was even thinking like, he's going to press 100. A few people are going to get it. They're not going to like it because it's not a good recording. Like I didn't know it was going to turn into a whole big thing. No, I don't think any of us really did.
It's wild because you guys are being bootlegged right away, and that thing winds up being something that's exchanging hands for $200 right away. Like there's like a fever around the band almost immediately, it seems. You know, like the Project X 7 inches bootlegged what, like 2 years after it came out for the first time?
Yeah, yeah. That was another quite bootleg record. And the t-shirts too.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times I get like some kid from Japan who will Instagram DM me and be like, "Is this an original Schism Project X shirt?" I'm like, "No, it is not." And somebody's passing it off as an original Schism shirt, and try to charge $500 for it, and it's obviously a bootleg.
Is it true you guys caught the bootlegger of the 7 inch? Because it was bootlegged using your plates, right? Or something. That's what. Oh, that was also once again a legend from back then.
Did we catch the bootlegger? I don't think we did.
I remember hearing that it was bootlegged with the plates because there's like apparently a bootleg that's near identical to the original one, and that was always something that people were
I
contesting back then.
I mean, it's could be possible because our plates, our masters, like everything, we never kept track of that stuff. It was almost impossible. Like we were on tour. Youth Today was on tour nonstop. Like we couldn't even keep apartments. Like I would literally get an apartment, and then 2 months later, I'd have to break the lease and lose my security deposit to go on tour. It's like even just to live in a place for 2 months was a long time. Usually it'd be like, okay, you're back from tour, sleep on somebody's couch for a month or 3 weeks or 2 weeks, and then you're out again. Like we were constantly on the road. So how are we supposed to keep, we couldn't even keep clothes. How are we going to keep masters of records and stuff? So a lot of that stuff was gone and kind of turned up, and people just sort of got them somehow. I don't know.
I remember Trash American Style had a stack of I think Chunking labels for a long time.
Yeah, he was really good friends with Jordan, so he probably got them from Jordan. Malcolm,
Yeah.
the owner.
Did, did you know Malcolm? Like Broken Talent, I guess had broken up
Yeah.
by the time he moved up to Connecticut, right? His
Oh yeah,
band.
we knew Malcolm. Yeah, we knew him for sure.
Was that the connection between you guys and GG Allin for the infamous GG Allin photo?
No, that was Michael Board from Maximum Rock and Roll.
Artless too, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and Artless. It was the whole thing was a practical joke. We knew Michael Board. Michael Board didn't really like. He was a big Maximum Rock and Roll guy. He was sort of like just from his column in Maximum Rock and Roll, he was pretty famous because Maximum Rock and Roll was pretty famous. But he didn't really go to shows that much, um, unless it was like a false prophet show or some of those off the beaten path. Sometimes you'd see him at a Reagan Youth show or something like that. But he was a huge record collector, and so he was a great guy to trade records with because I had so much punk stuff and I had really rare punk stuff. Like I was a completist. Like I had every Devo single. I had every Discord single. I had them in black. I had them in every color. I would like to get everything. Like I had every Exclaim record, and plus I had every Devo single, I had every X-Ray Spec single. So I had a lot of like stuff like that. And I had a lot of doubles and stuff. So Michael Board actually had a lot of these hardcore records that he didn't care about. And we would trade, I would trade him punk stuff. I believe I got The Kids Will Have Their Say from Michael Board because he was like, this record's garbage. I was like, I'll trade you this Devo single. Done. So me and Ray were friends with him just from trading records. And he was a pretty cool guy, I thought. I didn't really know him that well, but he seemed pretty cool. And then one time when we were hanging out with him, he was like, hey, there's this really cool guy, GG Allin. He loves Youth of Today. He loves New York hardcore. He plays like he's from Vermont or something, but he plays like stuff like just like New York hardcore. And he's this up and coming guy, and his band is playing, and you should really go see him. He goes, I'll get you in. I'll get you in. I'll get you backstage. You can go check him out. And no one knew who GG Allin was. Like I said, free internet, free anything. I had no clue. And it was at the Cat Club. I practically went just because I wanted to go to the Cat Club because the Cat Club was like a really, really, really nice rock club. Like the fact that GG Allin played the Cat Club and even somehow got booked at the Cat Club is beyond me. That must have been like one of those great rock and roll swindles too, because I'm sure whoever booked GG Allin was like, this is the next up and coming rock act, because usually it was only like Motley Crue or like, those hair metal bands used to play the Cat Club. So they probably sold it to him like GG Allin, the new rock and roll sensation. And, I'm sure somehow or other it was a con job to even get him to play there. So we were like, okay, cool, we'll go. We just loved going out. It was like, we used to go out every night. If there's something cool to do, we would go do it. So we went to the Cat Club with Michael Board and we're waiting backstage. And then GG Allin rolls in. And I tell you, at that time, he didn't look so crazy. Like he had that scum fuck you middle finger tattoo. But when he walked in, he just sort of looked like a rocker. Like he looked like, he had like a sleeveless vest and, he had kind of like the black eye makeup and he had like a bandana around his head. Have you ever seen that picture of
Oh
me,
my God, it's
Ray,
one of my
and
favorite
Gigi?
photos ever. Yes, I've
Yeah.
studied that photo since I was a kid.
So that was like early Gigi, and he just kind of looked semi-normal. Like to me, he just looked like he was in like a rock band or something, you know. Uh, and he was actually like that first time that we met him backstage. He was actually pretty normal. Like he was like, "Hey guys, hey, cool," and Michael Bohr was like, "Yeah, these are the guys from that band Youth of Today." That I was telling you about. And he was like, oh, and he started laughing. Oh, these are the guys. Oh, straight edge. And he like had a bottle of like Jack Daniels. And he like took a big gulp out of it. Yeah, straight edge is great. And he like, took a big swig out of his Jack Daniels bottle. And we're just like, this is some crazy rocker, dude. Oh my God. When he started playing, that was like, I couldn't even believe it. We were at the side of the stage. And first of all, he looked like he was just wearing kind of like jeans and like a punk belt and like a vest, jean vest. And then he came out wearing nothing but a jock strap. And like we're sitting there by the side of the stage, and then he walked on stage. I was like, "Whoa!" Like what the hell? And then it was all downhill from there. It was typical GG craziness. The show got stuck. And it was so weird because the show was so crazy and like he was attacking people in the crowd and somehow or other they didn't pull the plug on him for maybe like 15, 20 minutes, which is beyond me. Like if I was in charge of it, I would have cut that power in the first minute. That's how crazy things were. But yeah, that was a crazy night.
Yeah, it's funny to think about the manager sitting there being like, "Well, it could still turn around. Like this could still, you know."
Yeah, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? Just got worse and worse and worse.
I think that's the show Roger from AF talked about when he was on here, being like he was like, "Oh, I'd seen Gigi for years, with the early stuff, but there was a turning point one day where it was a different Gigi, and he warned me beforehand. He's like, "Oh, Roger, you might want to take a step back tonight. I took a bunch of laxatives."
I don't think Roger was there.
Okay.
If Roger was there, I would have known because there wasn't a lot of people there. Um, but yeah, he did probably take a lot of laxatives that night too.
It's funny too because it just seems like no one, even the people that did know what it was, could believe it was going to be as bad as it was till it was too late.
Yeah, that was me and Ray.
You brought up Max and Rock and Roll there, and I've always found the relationship between you guys and Max Rock and Roll so interesting because AF obviously had a famously contentious relationship with them, but like you guys stayed at the MRR house, right? Like on the first tour.
Yeah, we had a good relationship with Tim Yohannan actually. We stayed there every tour, every single time that we played in Northern California. We would stay at Maximum Rock and Roll, and he was very welcoming to us. He was very cool to us. He was super vocal about not being into straight edge, and straight edge was fascist, and this whole new straight edge scene that's emerging is like a fascist scene. But he liked us somehow. He liked us just as people. We would joke around with him, and we liked him. And yeah, I always felt super welcome at Maximum Rock and Roll. He was the king of record collectors, Tim Yohannan. He had everything. So part of the cool thing about staying there was just geeking out on every single record. Like he had everything. It's unbelievable.
It's so fascinating too, that magazine, like how much of an impact that thing would have globally, like in spreading bands. And I guess there's a certain point where that relationship seems to sour a little bit, at least with Ray and Tim, because there's that infamous kind of cover when Ray went Krishna with Ray on the cover, and then there's like a really sort of intense back and forth interview, mainly from Tim's side in that issue. But that stuff went around the world. Like that was like pre-internet. That was like our People magazine, like for punk
It
rock.
was. It was. That was the only way that you could find out what was going outside of your little bubble of a scene, which was so important because, um, man, I made so many connections with bands and with people and with promoters. Um, it was very, very helpful for a touring band to get Maximum Rock and Roll. I'll tell you that. They had the scene reports, and you could, they had the address of the guy that wrote the scene report, and sometimes a phone number, and you could call them up. Hey, we're running through town too. Can you set up a show? And it was a big tool for bands also to be able to tour all over the world, really.
Oh, that's right up until I guess the internet kind of supplants it at a certain point. Like Book Your Own Fucking Life into the 2000s was like the essential document for getting out there and touring as a band. Like you could just kind of like flip through there and have every promoter at your fingertips. Not everyone was great, but some were.
Yeah, and he was cool. He did that. He did he printed a very early interview with Youth of Today, right when Can't Close My Eyes came out. And I tell you, that probably had a lot to do with the popularity of Youth of Today, because it was this really cool interview with all these really cool, crazy pictures of like Ray jumping around and stuff. And right when that coordinated with the release of Can't Close My Eyes, it was almost like a national thing. Like, oh, let me check this out.
Yeah, it really like I love reading those old Youth of the Day interviews in Maximum Rock and Roll. And I think that's the thing about you guys is you become so canonized as, and I say you guys, I mean not just Youth of the Day, I mean this whole kind of scene, like youth crew, I guess generally to kind of put a label on it really early on, where these things become passed around, reprinted in other zines. Like obviously we talked about you guys being bootleg. Like it feels like early on it must have been resistance towards you guys, but at a certain point it feels like everywhere you guys went, there would be a band that kind of popped up in your wake that would be like the local, once again, for lack of a better term, youth crew band.
Yeah. Maximum Rock and Roll had a lot to do with like whether they liked it or not, the starting of the straight edge scene.
How much of that was like around when you guys first formed? Like, we talked about Abused was there, obviously Minor Threat, SSD, but it doesn't feel like there was any sort of like semblance of it by around 84, 85 even.
Even in Violent Children, you know, which was like 84. Either they started in 85. I joined Violent Children in 1984. So there was no straight edge. Not only was there no straight edge, but all the people in the scene, whether it was like New York or whether it was like, Connecticut, all like the elder people in the scene, like the well-respected people in the scene. I remember, me and Ray were straight edge, so we would put X's on our hands, and we would come to the Anthrax, and people would be like, "Really? Like an X on your hand? Don't that like that died with Minor Threat? Like, what are you guys doing? Like, there's no straight edge anymore." Like, it was almost like straight edge was this little blip in time of that Minor Threat song, and it kind of died. And yeah, they would be like, "Don't you understand? Like, even all of Minor Threat weren't straight edge. Like, it wasn't even a thing when Minor Threat was around. Why are you trying to make it a thing?" you know? kind of thing. So it was considered something that happened. You missed the boat. Not going to happen again. That it was a Minor Threat song that belonged to Minor Threat. Why are you guys trying to dig up straight edge? Like it was almost like a ridiculous thing when Youth Today first started playing. But I tell you, a lot of people loved fast, loud, rebellious hardcore, but they did not like going to shows and people drunk out of their minds and fights and violence and glue sniffing and people nodding out from heroin at CBGBs. That was such a reality of not only the New York hardcore scene, because we had moved to New York at the time, but every scene. Like when Youth Today started touring, we did our first tour the beginning of 1986, our West Coast tour. And we pretty much just kept going. And the scene was super drug filled, was crazy. Like you would just go to show and everybody just whacked out of their minds. And it was dangerous and it was fights. But there was a whole new crop of kids that was like, we don't want to do, we love hardcore. We love Minor Threat. We love, and it was a real weird time for hardcore itself too, for like loud, fast hardcore, like Minor Threatish kind of music, because that was considered on its way out. Like Minor Threat had broken up, SSD went metal, Agnostic Front went metal. Like a lot of bands were going metal. The Necros went rock. A lot of bands were moving on to kind of like different things, these kind of like stalwarts of the scene. And so even like thrash music with a mosh part in it was seemed as passe and something that happened in the past. But we loved that stuff. We loved it. Like we wanted to play. We're like, what? I'm only 17. Like, we still love this stuff. We want a mosh. We want a stage dive, you know? So we kind of like that. It was one of the express interests of Youth Today to bring back that kind of hardcore. That's why we called the band Youth of Today. We tried to think of the most generic hardcore name we could think of to say, like, we like this music. We don't want it to die. We want to resurrect this kind of like very fast, hardcore with mosh parts, and you can mosh and stage dive to it. And it was almost like Youth Today. We wrote the songs, keeping it in mind how people are going to mosh to the song. You know what I mean? Really, really super fast bar. Dun, 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 like the music was written to be moshed to almost. And so, that was almost like the unspoken mission statement of Youth of Today. We're going to resurrect this music.
That's almost the thing with hardcore too, is that there is that consideration of what the audience is going to think about what you're doing, because the audience is as much a part of the band's performance as the band is. So I think that's like in breaking with sort of like rock and roll tradition, where it's like, no, it's all about this performance. Like in hardcore, it's like, no, how's the audience going to react to this? Are they going to go off for this part of the song, or are they just going to sit on their hands?
Yeah. Yeah, we wanted to play music that you could get crazy to. Because that was the music that we liked, you know? And that was the music, to all those early bands that we, used to, I remember, I saw Agnostic Front before Victim in Pain came out. Um, so all that kind of like early New York hardcore stuff, we loved it. And we wanted to play music like that.
There's this compilation that I picked up years ago, and it's got like Thurston Moore doing a song solo. It's like a Glenn Branca, like no wave type compilation. I think it's Thurston Moore or Lee Ronaldo. There's a song on it called Youth of Today. And you mentioned going to 99 Records. That wouldn't have been where you got the name from, because I've heard other places that suggested it was from other bands' lyrics and
Well,
songs.
Thurston Moore was hardcore and he had a fanzine, and He gave Break Down the Walls the worst it was either Break Down the Walls or Can't Close My Eyes, but he gave it the worst review ever. Like ever. Maximum Rock and Roll gave Break Down the Walls a horrible review. Maximum Rock and Roll said this record sucks because they're trying to push a patriotic American agenda. That's why they made the cover red, white, and blue. And I remember we went there on that Break Down the Walls tour. I was like, Tim, you know us. How many times have we stayed here? Are we these patriotic, jingoistic, pro-American, like skinhead guys? Not at all. I was like, the cover isn't even red, white, and blue. The cover's blue, and the pictures are outlined in red and white. Like, it doesn't look like a flag. And he was like, no, you guys picked those colors to be pro-American. And we were just like, Tim, I'm here to tell you that we did it. Like, why would I lie to you? Why would you take a massive assumption and our record? You didn't say anything about the music. You didn't say anything about the lyrics. All you did was pan the record because you said the cover was red, white, and blue. I remember we were friends with Pusshead too. Pusshead, because Pusshead used to hang out at Maximum Rock and Roll. We met him at Maximum Rock and Roll. We skated with Pusshead, and we were friends with him. And then he did Puss Zone in Thrasher, and he also trashed Break Down the Walls. He just trashed it. He's like, this is the worst paint by the numbers, crappy ass hardcore, generic hardcore that I have ever heard. This is the worst record. We were like, damn, man, our buddy Pusshead threw us under the bus.
I don't know what Pushead's problem is, but it seems with like Tim Johann at a certain point, there was a narrative that was being pushed that East Coast hardcore in general was a certain way, and that was nationalistic, and in particular New York and New York adjacent hardcore in Maximum Rock and Roll. And obviously later on, his position on this stuff would evolve, but it felt like for a few years that was kind of the party line. I guess you guys kind of got swept up in it.
Yeah. Um, yeah. He was a character. Just like we all were characters, you know? It was almost like, you know, he hit our thing was straight edge. His thing was like ultra radical punk, you know, political punk, you know, politics, and anything that even freaking, you know, drew outside of the lines of his kind of paradigm, he would instantly hate it. I like to think that youth of today softened him up a little bit. I really do. Because we were very friendly and we would call him on his stuff, and, you know, we would kind of like joke about stuff.
It feels like that was the great thing about um, that time period, I guess, before everything, more hard lines got divided, is the fact that you had all these different people, all these different scenes mixing together. And when Roger was on the show, we talked about how even though obviously the isms are completely different between Tim and Roger, at the end of the day, it's like two guys that had dedicated their life to punk rock and wanted to build scene and wanted to provide space that was safe for the people they cared about and to make music or to make culture kind of happen. And like, I think that's a great thing about punk politics, that it is like we're all kind of like at the core just trying to make this thing work in some way.
And that is the crux of why we got along with Tim Johann. Because I think there was sort of a mutual respect. Like, we were a bunch of like very passionate kids who, we had this band and we truly believed in the stuff that we were singing about, you know. And I think he picked us up like, hey, these kids are kind of like, they're idealistic and they're doing their best to try to live by those ideals. Like, I think he respected that, and we respected him. Here's this guy, you know, he's done a lot for this, you know, American hardcore scene, and, you know, we respect him. And, you know, even when he gave Break Down the Walls a bad review, we just kind of laughed it off, you know?
It feels like there was an adverse reaction from a lot of people to you guys. Like I got into this stuff kind of during that mid '90s or late '90s youth crew revival, and I remember talking to the older kids, and there was like a real either love of Youth Today or a rejection of Youth Today. And as a fan of the band, I felt like a lot of the rejection had nothing to do with you guys. Like talking to people being like, "Oh, I didn't get into Youth Today when it got all hardline militant straight edge." I'm like, have you ever listened to Youth Today or checked out the lyrics? Like, I think people lump it in with Project X stuff, maybe, but there's just seems like there's like a real misconstruing of the vibe of the band. At least what I'm picking up is the vibe being of the band.
Well, Youth Today was a completely polarizing band. Luckily for us, that this huge straight edge scene developed in the like later 80s, because by 1988, it was only straight edge kids coming to our shows. But luckily, we would play a show and there'd be like 800 straight edge kids there. You know, that scene, wow. To go from like 1985 to like 1988 and just see what happened with straight edge was pretty incredible. And for us as kids, we felt like, wow, we're on this like first wave. And it wasn't just us, you know, it was Gorilla Biscuits, it was Bold, it was all these, you know, bands, you know, Instead and Uniform Choice, you know, from California. Uh, but it was really cool. We really felt like, wow, we're on the forefront of this like burgeoning youth movement with thousands and thousands and thousands of kids just like giving up drinking and doing drugs. We're like, this is fantastic.
I feel like it was you guys, like not to diminish anything that all these other bands did. A lot of them that have been on the show give you guys credit. And you know, Uniform Choice, I guess, put out the record first, but like it's Youth of Today that's kind of creating this secular religion known as straight edge. And it's like you look at Minor Threat as being this sort of like thing. And I really do wonder how much I think Ian's still kind of conflicted about the legacy of straight edge. Al, of course, with SSD, I think loves the fact that you guys did what you did with it, but you guys were the guys that just brought it to the world, it seems. And I like Ray obviously is a great front person. These songs that you guys are writing being incredible, like really kind of like proselytize this like movement.
Yeah, and it's kind of, you know, I'm proud of that. Yeah, I wouldn't take full credit for it. I think we probably did play a big part in it, but that's so cool. Like, imagine being 18 years old and you're kind of involved in this just strictly underground DIY movement that organically pops out of like this music scene. It was amazing.
Oh, and like what a gift as a kid to find something that is like a kind of like burden free identity, not identity, but like something to hold on to, something to embrace as a kid that didn't want to drink and didn't want to do drugs. Like even if it is just a trend to the kid, like what a great thing for them to have a few years where they're just focused on living a positive moment. Like I broke edge years ago, but I have no regrets about spending my teenage years as this kid that like rejected all this bullshit around me. Like it was a huge thing. And like and look at like CM Punk or Avril Lavigne Xing up. Like this has become so much bigger than just the music even.
Yeah. And it's worldwide now. I mean, we played in like Jakarta and there's millions of straight edge kids there. It's almost like bigger and you know, sometimes it's bigger in like South America and like Southeast Asia and stuff. I mean, we played Russia and there was tons and tons and tons of straight edge kids there.
Yeah, it's
You
wild.
know, for you know, just you know, along that same lines of thinking, for me personally, it was being in youth today was very, very cool because at a very young, like you know, I started youth today when I was 18. Ray was 19, I was 18. Sammy was 15 or 13 or something like that. You know, Walter was just a kid too. From youth of today was definitely for us. The band was a mission. Like we were on a mission. Like we really deeply felt like, you know what, doing drugs, drinking, it's a waste of time. It ruins people's lives. You know, just look at all the negative outcomes that come from this thing. Like, if we can inspire just even like a handful of kids to, live their life in a more positive direction, like, let's just go out and do that. Like, let's try to walk the talk and be inspiring. And, hopefully we can make a dent in this scene that you know, we have this kind of like voice to. And so it was cool because it wasn't just a band. Like, most people get in a band because I want to be in a band. I want the band to be popular. And I want to, sell a ton of records, or, in the rock scene, I want to get rich and famous for my band. With You Today, it wasn't like that. We had a different bar of what success was. Success to us was, if we can change some people's lives, even in just like a little way towards the better, then fantastic. That's our bar of success. And when you do that, the message of the band is much bigger than even the band itself. And so by the time I was 18, and it was unbelievable, because when we started Youth of Today, the band got so big so fast. Oh man, my AirPods are dying. All right, so getting back to that. So here's the thing, like, I'm an 18-year-old kid, and I'm living this life that I'm part of a bigger picture, and what I'm doing is contributing to the lives of other people. And I tell you, I still get people that come up to me. Oh my God, I'm so, like, I just have to sincerely tell you, Youth Today changed my life. I was a dumb young kid, and I got those Youth Today records, and it completely turned my whole life around. And even like you, for example, like, for people that maybe the straight edge thing wasn't a lasting thing, for them to just like have this impression in their minds of when they were a young kid that, let me lead a more positive life, a more kind of healthy, positive life, which was the kind of thing that we were pushing. And like, the vegetarian thing was also very important. So many people became vegetarian. For me, that was like, I got this taste of life isn't about what you can take. Life is about what you can give. And because the whole thing about Youth Today is like, we're trying to give this message that we really feel in our hearts is like a really good message, and it changed our life. Maybe it could change your life too. And that has stuck with me to this day. Like, to this day, I'm always like on a mission. Like, what can I get into that's going to make a dent in this world? Like, I've been chasing that since I was 18, because it's such a good feeling. It's such a good feeling to be part of something that positively impacts the lives of the community around you.
There must have been a point where, because there is that point after the first European tour, you guys are in like the Face magazine or ID magazine, right? There's that famous article. I think Sammy talked about you guys meeting with Michael Alago and the possibility of maybe signing to another label.
Yeah.
Was there that temptation to see like how far can we take this, or were you guys already kind of on different journeys at that point?
No. Youth of Today, the trajectory of Youth of Today was like this: up, 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 we break up. Like, we were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the shows were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we went to Europe, and we kind of broke into like, positive straight edge hardcore kind of broke into this whole new market in like Europe. It was almost like, by the time Youth Today broke up, it was almost like the sky's the limit. Like, where are we going to take it? It was almost like, we're going to change the whole freaking world. And then, of course, Ray got into Krishna, and he quit the band. And it made no sense to us, because it seemed like the band was just getting bigger and bigger. And after we played Europe, then we were getting all these invitations to play other places too. It was almost like we were going to take this thing all around the world. And who knows? Who knows what what would have happened with you today? And like I think like the sound that we had come up with songs like Disengaged, like for that last record, if we had actually made a whole record of stuff like that, it probably would have opened up a whole kind of like new world. So it was I often think about what would have happened with youth today if we kept on going for like another year or two. But you know, things were changing and it wasn't meant to be.
Well, it almost ends perfectly, right? And like it doesn't carry on. You don't get that, like what happens if the next record was the How We Rock moment for the band without realizing it. I think in the band you don't even realize that you're writing the How We Rock record until it's already out.
Yeah,
Um,
that's true. It did end on a good note with that last 7 inch, for
yeah, and
sure.
it does keep it, and it's sort of this idea, like you're saying, the idea is bigger than the band, and the idea is really what winds up spreading, and certainly your influence on people, musicians that wind up, you know, becoming ginormous. Like, actually, I wanted to ask you, you had a band with Zach De La Roca for a minute too, right?
I just talked about this in this other podcast I did. We never really had a band. Judge had broken up and Inside Out had broken up, and I was friends with Zach. I was living in Huntington Beach. I was working for Revelation, and Zach used to hang out. And I was living at the Revelation house, and Zach used to hang out there all the time. And I had known him from Youth Today. We were friendly from the times he was in Hard Stance. Youth Today played a bunch of shows with Hard Stance. And I was like, Zach, me and you should do a band. And he was like, that's a great idea. That's a great idea. So we only got together once. He came over to the Rev House, and I had my guitar, and we were kind of just like messing around with stuff. But that's really like that first thing of just me and him just kind of messing around, thinking about like what sound the band should have. I remember we were like, yeah, what sound should it have? Should it be hardcore? Should it be more like a metal influence? We were just kind of throwing out ideas. And I remember one of the things he said was we should call the band Rage Against the Machine. And I said, no, that name is too long.
Because that's a song on there's like a Inside Out tape trader thing, right? Where they have that's one of their songs that was going to wind up on their next LP, apparently.
There's an unreleased Inside Out song.
Yeah, then and there's like a live recording of it too that my roommate used to have that we used to nerd out about. But they're another band that like imagine if they had kept going to that LP because it felt like that there was not where obviously Rage Against the Machine wound up going, but there was sort of this trajectory with them too. It felt like.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But it was meant to be like literally like right after that, he started practicing with those guys from Rage Against the Machine. And I remember it was like Zach would hang out all the time, and then all of a sudden you just wouldn't really see him because he was always in LA jamming out with those guys for like a year. I mean, they really worked on those songs for they were dedicated to it. Like Zach just disappeared, and all he did was that weird band, and like we didn't know what it was. He was hanging out with those weird guys in LA doing some rap band, and we don't know what's going on with it. And then next thing you know, Rage Against the Machine are the biggest band in the whole entire world. It was so crazy. It was so crazy to see. It was like I was proud of him because here's like one of our own, and he just makes it really big. I thought it was the coolest thing.
Oh, and like look, Steve Aoki's got a Gorilla Biscuits back piece tattoo. There's like I think the influence sonically obviously is massive of the scene, but I think the cultural influence is ginormous, right? Like the bootleg Supreme shit. Like there's a lot of uncredited influence that you guys have, or not even necessarily uncredited, but like maybe not as necessarily perceptible influence that you guys have.
Yeah, and it was cool for Rage Against the Machine too because Green Day were getting big, Rancid were getting big, The Offspring were getting big, but no one like he was the guy that was from our scene. He was from the straight edge hardcore scene, and he was the guy who was stage diver for Gorilla Biscuits and you today. Like he was one of us. Um, And so it was he was like the first guy from the hardcore scene to actually, maybe the only guy from the hardcore scene to become like just a full-fledged rock star.
I think now there's probably a few more. Now you're testing me, but like you're right. Like there's no one like that. Like there's a certain upper echelon. I guess the Beastie Boys, but there's like an upper echelon that people can reach that very few hit.
Yeah, the Beastie Boys were definitely from the New York hardcore scene, but it wasn't like they were from our scene.
Oh, Nate from the Foo Fighters played in Brotherhood, so that's definitely from Youth of Day Worship.
That's true. Yeah.
So we've got, but you're right. There's not as many sort of like, not as many that wore the X's on their hands out there.
Yeah. We met him on that first Youth of the Day tour too.
With Diddley Squat, was that his band back
Yeah.
then?
Diddley Squad. I think Diddley Squad played that show.
He probably did the show, I would imagine, because he used to do all the shows back then.
I remember that we kind of hung out with him and all of his friends, and they brought us, they were like, you guys want to go cliff diving? We were like, yeah, sure. And they brought us to the highest, most, you can't even believe how high this cliff was. Like, we used to jump off of like rocks and stuff, growing up, whatever. But they brought us to this like mass cliff. They're like, you guys jump off of this thing? And there was one hardcore guy that the first guy, I think it was one of the Diddley Squat guys. He got to that cliff and he stood facing us and he just did a backflip off a massive cliff. We were just like, this scene is incredible.
Oh, that's fucking wild. Um, Speaking of bands you guys played with, a show that I'm obsessed with is the show you guys played with the band Boom and the Legion of Doom in
Yeah.
Detroit, where they showed up with the Dead Deers.
Yeah, it was funny because I was just talking with John Brannon about this.
I always bring it up to him too.
Um, because we're pretty sure because Boom and Legion of Doom played that show, and they had all the deer parts and they were throwing them around and stuff, and it was I fucking hated those guys, quite honestly. I thought they were fucking assholes. And then the next day, all of our equipment got stolen out of our van, and the rumor was it was Boom and Legion of Doom. They found out where we were staying, and they came that, and we stayed out in the suburbs with some straight edge kid in like a really nice house, and they came, broke into the van, and stole all of our stuff.
And like that's after they already threw deer carcass all over it too.
Yeah, yeah,
They seem like one of those bands that like, like GG Allin, like maybe don't get the credit that GG Allin does, but they certainly left a mark on every band they played with.
yeah. They left a mark on me. For can't stand them.
Speaking of what could have been, what did you think of Ray Flex and Reflex from Pain when Ray was singing for it?
Well, I loved Reflex from playing. I loved every single one of those Connecticut hardcore bands. I thought CIA were one of the greatest bands I ever saw. Reflex from Pain were great. I saw them a bunch of times with the singer that sang on that record. I loved Vatican Commandos. I probably saw Vatican Commandos 100 times. I went to every single one of their shows. They used to play like parties at like high school parties, and I would just go just because I loved them. I loved No Milk on Tuesday. I loved them all. I loved them all. They
Bodies in
were
Panic, were they from there or no? No, they're not Connecticut, right?
No Milk on Tuesday.
No, Bodies in Panic.
They were from Westchester, I think.
Okay.
Those guys were my brothers in arms. I loved them all. I loved that scene. I loved what's that other band?
Seizure.
Seizure.
Oh,
Sex Bomb.
fucking
I
amazing.
love Seizure. I love Sex Bomb. I love them all. Uh, and we used to play with those guys all the time. Um,
Was Ray in Reflex from Pain at the same time as Vatican
well,
Commandos?
Ray joined Reflex from Pain, and I saw the first show that they played their first show with Ray at the Anthrax, and you know what? I thought he was incredible. Like when they kicked him out of the band, I couldn't believe it. I was like, why would they ever kick him out of the band? He's like, he always played drums, so nobody knew he was a great front man. But then he joins Reflex from Pain, and oh my God, like he was just a nobody went off more than Ray Capo. Like in his heyday, when he was like, 19, 20 years old, 18, 19, 20, he was the greatest frontman of all time. Like literally. And even in Reflex from Pain, he was great. They played a show with, I think they played a show somewhere and Harley saw them. And Harley was like, Harley loved Reflex from Pain with Capo singing. He was like, "Oh my God, this band is like is incredible." So it seemed like they were getting a little traction, but it was a whole kind of coup because they wanted Bones from CIA to sing because they didn't think Ray could sing good enough, and they wanted somebody that could actually sing. So there was a coup. They kind of kicked him out, and then they mixed Reflex from Pain with CIA, and it became 76% Uncertain.
I love because that eventually Malcolm put that out as a flexi disc, the Reflex from Pain with Ray singing
Oh,
recording.
really? Oh,
Yeah. And it was like, he must have pressed like tons of them because it was one of those records that you could find in the 90s relatively easy. So that was what I heard before I heard the actual Reflex from Pain 7-inch. So that's what I thought it was supposed to sound like. But it's interesting the evolution of his voice from that to Youth of Today, where it's a lot more restrained, I guess, at that point. Like it evolves quickly to where it kind of goes.
yeah. Well, it gave me great faith that Youth of Today was going to be a substantial band because I had seen him singing for Reflex from Pain, and I was like, man, this guy's like one of the greatest frontmen. Like he would go out, mosh around in the crowd with the mic. You could just see that this guy is special. And so when we started Youth of Today, I had high hopes that the band was actually going to be like a really good band.
What about Mike Judge singing? Like, were you aware that what he was going to kind of be like beforehand? Did you kind of know? Because I really do think that and it comes up all the time once again doing this show, that he's one of those super underrated but incredibly influential vocalists and lyricists too.
I remember Youth of Today had briefly broken up. Before we did We're Not This Alone, Youth Today broke up for like just like a few months. I think it was just like we just toured nonstop and everybody was getting on each other's nerves and we were trying to write songs for another record. And Ray really loved that Blast record. And he was trying to make us be this kind of like Blast, almost like Black Flag type band. And the rest of the band, and Mike was in the band. Mike was playing drums at that time. And the rest of the band, we could not be any less interested in playing that. We're like, we're Youth Today. What are you talking about? We're the hardcore band. It's our whole steez.
He was getting his Rollins on.
Yeah, he was trying to get his Rollins on, and we didn't like it. And then he got all offended. And then we broke up just for like a few months. But during that time that we broke up for the few months, that's when Judge started because we didn't have any band anymore. And Mike was like, "Man, I want to do a band, um, and I want to be super straight edge, and I want to be the type of band because at that time, straight edge got so big so fast, and it was so polarizing that you either loved it or you hated it." And the people that loved it, they loved it more than anything in like the whole world. It changed their whole life. And then the people that hated it, they were like, we can't stand this new kind of thing that's happening in our punk rock scene. And so there's a lot of people that, were super vocally critical about straight edge just in general. And Mike was like, you know what? What is wrong with people? Like, okay, so there's a few people that choose to better their lives and other people can't stand it. So Mike was like really flipped out over people that would be critics of straight edge. It's like, what the hell? We're just over here trying to live our best life. And he's like, I want to start a band that those type of people will really hate. I never heard him sing. He said he wanted to sing. And when he said he wanted to sing, I
didn't think he was going to be able to do it. Like if you knew Mike, he was the quietest, most to this day, he's the quietest, most introverted, kind of like socially awkward guy. When he said he wanted to sing, I was like, how's he going to be able to pull this off? Like the guy can't even talk. Like he doesn't even like to talk in a crowd. Like he was just that type of kid, which is, what I think was almost the glory of Judge, because his social awkwardness. There's a lot of kids that are like that, and like that kind of like people that were like that, they really got into Judge. It was almost like the broken toys of the hardcore scene really loved Judge because Mike was kind of like that. It's like your vibe attracts your tribe. So I think eventually that thing, it actually almost worked in his favor that he was like that, because there was a lot of other people that like that could completely relate with him. So I never heard him sing. We practiced and I really liked the songs, like right from the get go, the songs that we were writing. I thought it was really cool because we were it wasn't paint by the numbers like youth today. We all like me and Mike both loved Oi. Like we loved Oi, and we were kind of incorporating some like Oi-ish qualities. Like New York Crew was kind of like our version of a hardcore Oi song, and we covered the Blitz song, and so we were bringing in like even some kind of like heavier elements. It wasn't really metal when we started, but we wanted it to be like real heavy, like Motorhead. Like Motorhead was like a big influence. So it was like I liked it because it wasn't just straight up hardcore. Like I thought like we were doing something that was a little different, and I like that. And I never heard Mike sing until he sang on the actual 7-inch that we recorded. And oh my God, I couldn't even believe that sound came out of his mouth. I mean, he just started singing and it was just like, whoa, like this guy sounds like Negative Approach or something. Like even better than Negative Approach.
He also kind of like there's like an emo. You touched on it there with like the broken toys thing, but there's like an emo quality to it, where like there's like a tough and a harshness to it, a hardness, but there's also like a sadness, which I think is also the underrated element of Minor Threat. Like you listen to the song Filler, there's also like a real anxiety and fear that's coming across from Ian, and you're getting like a peek behind the curtain of the singer. And I think a lot of those Judge lyrics fully rip it apart, like the insecurity and sort of the anguish of dealing with just life and being up there. And I think that's a huge influence on stuff that came after.
I mean, I always say that Mike started emo because his lyrics were like, he was such a like a, it was such a dichotomy too, because he was like this rough and tough biker guy, but his lyrics were like even on the 7-inch, like that's like when we were doing that 7-inch, his girlfriend for many years had broken up with him, and he wrote that song "I've Lost," like this like heart on your sleeve song about your girlfriend breaking up with you, and you're so heartbroken that you can barely deal with it. What hardcore singer was singing about stuff like that back then? Nobody.
Yeah.
And I thought like how gutsy and vulnerable the guy to write lyrics like that. A song like the song "Like You." Oh God, I'm fucking lost. There was some real vulnerability to his lyrics that really resonated with people.
Yeah, even like a line like "Those drugs are going to kill you if I don't get you first." I remember reading that almost like there's a desperation in that, like you're trying to save someone. As much as like people are like, "No, it's a threat," but I'm like, I don't know. Judging by the rest of the lyrics here, there's also like a compassion to it there.
So even that, like, he spoke that with, like, when he sang that, there's some like real meaning and depth and like heart, that was really heartfelt for him. It wasn't just some stupid, you know, um, lyric to just, get a rise out of people. Like that was something in his life that he was actually a fucked up thing in his life that he was actually dealing with.
And
So,
it feels like it at some point. Um, there's that video. I think the Runs video of you guys playing in California, and the Nazi skinheads show up, and there's a huge fight, and going on like and there's sort of like stories of this happening at multiple shows, and then it just it must have just like burnt him out to go out there every night and just feel people misinterpreting things or violence being around the shows or fucking Nazis showing up too, which I guess has nothing to do with anything.
There was tons of Nazis. The Nazis loved Judge. It was so weird. We would play shows, and there'd be a bunch of Nazi skinheads there, and they would be singing along like, "Yeah, we love Judge."
So was it the Oi thing? Do you think that was that kind of drew them to it, like the Oi imagery or the Blitz cover and stuff like that?
Probably. Yeah, I'm not really sure, but skinheads and even Nazi skinheads really loved Judge, which is why Mike wrote the song "Bringing It Down" because he wanted to frickin' put the line in the sand that we're not into this.
Yeah,
Because so many Nazis were coming to our shows.
yeah. Which also happened with like you hear that with Jimmy Percy from Sham 69 at a certain point, like just getting exhausted by it and like these guys not getting like, no, this is not for you at all. Like there's lyrics that are directly against you.
That last Judge tour that we did, that's a good word for it. It was exhausting. Like there was so much violence and just every show was ending in some sort of like fight. And, you do that, you're on a 40 show tour and that happens every single night. By the end of that, like 2 months, you're just like, what the hell's going on? And Judge had this real reputation as being a tough guy band. And so, of course, your vibe attracts your tribe. You're going to get a lot of tough guys that are coming to the show. An interesting fact about Judge being a tough guy band. We were a tough guy band, but it wasn't the band. It was our roadie. We had this roadie named Boss Man. As a matter of fact, the guy that beats up those Nazis single-handedly in that Runs video, that's our roadie, Boss Man. So Boss Man had just gotten back from the Gulf War. He got back from the Gulf War. He was a Marine on the front lines of the Gulf War, just killing people for months on end. Like the stories he would tell us in the van, he would just be like, you'd walk into this village, everybody hates you, everybody's shooting at you from every building. I have bullets just whizzing by my head. There's bombs going off. You don't know if you're going to step on a landmine and something would move and you just shoot anywhere. And then after you like got into the village, after the firefight was over, you just realized that you just killed like 30 kids.
Holy fuck.
And like you can imagine that we didn't know it, but he had like extreme PTSD. This is before people even knew what PTSD was. Can you imagine he goes from like literally killing families and kids and this fucked up war situation, being on the front line of that war. And then he comes back and like a few days later, he's going on tour with Judge. This guy is getting in fights every single night. It was almost like, okay, we've made you, like the Marines made him into this killing machine. And how do you turn that off? You can't. Like he's coming on tour with Judge and then every single night he's getting into fights. He's messed up in the head. And so that's why Judge got this big, and God forbid, and he's like a big, tough Marine guy looking for a fight. God forbid anybody said, like we played a show and someone said, fuck you, straight edge or whatever. That guy's dead. That is toast. You know what I mean? Holy this shit. Guy's looking for an excuse and not only would he beat people up, like he would beat them senseless. Like we would have to pull him off people like, dude, you're going to kill this person. So that reputation, and he became our roadie. He was like our number one roadie.
How'd you know him? Was he like someone you knew before he went over?
Yeah, him and Mike were really good friends before he shipped off to the Middle East.
Because there's that like quote that I think is the Lost and Found bootleg of Chunking Can Suck It, where it's like Mike in the van, I think talking to you, talking about how burnt out he was and now it's over.
I wrote that. It's on the back of that Lost and Found record.
Yeah, which is I remember reading that as a kid and now being in a band and being like, I can definitely relate to it. And I wasn't dealing with half the shit you're describing. Like that must have been just like the most fucking stressful tour Like way worse than any of these Youth of Today tours that you had done, it seems.
Oh, dude, it was way different. Like Youth of Today would go on tour, and everything was great. Every kid is this really nice straight edge kid. We go stay at a kid's house. His parents are cooking for us. There's no fights. Everything's just like a good, positive vibe. Everybody's vegetarian. Everybody's straight edge. We're just here. We're celebrating this kind of like positive lifestyle that we're all involved in. And the vibe was so high. Like it was such a pleasure to go on tour with you today. In the beginning days, it was like nuts because everybody hated us and threw bottles at us. But by the time like Break Down the Walls and We're Not This Alone came out, going on tour was nothing but a pleasure. Like you would make a million friends, good vibes, everything was awesome. Going on tour with Judge, and it's like you don't know if you're going to survive that night. Like it was the worst vibes. It was like the worst vibes.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine.
And that just broke all of our spirits for just doing the band.
Like leaving that situation, did you guys do the Ray and Porcell 7-inch before or after that?
We recorded that way before.
Way before, okay. Like I guess leaving that situation, were you just kind of like burnt out on everything at that point? Like pre-shelter, like
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
it
I
also
joined,
feels like, oh, go on, sorry.
I joined Gorilla Biscuits for a year. I played in Gorilla Biscuits in 1990, and that was fun too. But the scene was definitely everything was changing. By like 1990, everything was changing. Like Judge had broken up. I was doing Gorilla Biscuits and I was playing in Gorilla Biscuits, but I really didn't feel like it was my band. You know, it was Walter and Sip's band, and me and Sammy and Tom Capone were playing in the band. Um, and then Walter was also doing Quicksand, and then Quicksand was getting big, so fast that Gorilla Biscuits actually ended up breaking up, and we never even recorded. Or we were supposed to record a record that was going to be on In Effect Records, but we broke up before we recorded it. So it was real like I was just kind of burnt out from Judge, and the scene was changing, and the scene in New York City was becoming super violent. Around like the early 90s, like forget it. There was people getting shot at shows like that. You know, there was like fights and things like that, but no one's getting shot and knifed, and you know, those were things that just didn't really happen. Like you might get a bloody nose, but now you might go to a show and actually get shot, which is like a whole different ball game.
Yeah, like it's interesting, like looking at hardcore through, and specifically hardcore, like at different periods, like how things change. And it feels like 90, 91, things change again. And I guess like Nirvana starts happening and Green Day and sort of this like next wave, but it got pretty heavy and pretty dark for a while there, it seems, in the early 90s.
Sure. I'm glad it changed. I'm glad that Nirvana record changed everything because it needed a change desperately.
You need those bands to get popular to repopulate the scene. Like you need like another jump on point for kids. Like you really do see it like, kids that got into it with Nirvana, kids that got into it with Green Day, no doubt later on. I guess Bleak 182, Rage Against the Machine, like these bands that are kind of like waving the flag for this scene. And not everyone's going to stay and not everyone's going to get involved in DIY hardcore and scene building, but some will.
Yeah. It was cool to see Green Day too because Green Day were part of that whole Gilman Street scene. We would always play Gilman Street. So it was cool to see them kind of rise up.
It's funny because you guys go to England, I think a year apart, and both of you tour with Jail Cell Recipes.
Oh, Green Day toured with Jail Cell Recipes?
Yeah, and when Billy Joe Armstrong was on the podcast after we got off the air, the first thing he asked me is like, "Do you know the band Jail Cell Recipes from England?" And saying that his kid was asking about him the other day, and it just blew his mind. He's like, "Yeah, I was on tour with that band." But yeah, Jail Cell Recipes feels like certainly in England that they were like a bridge between these two different kind of subsects of DIY hardcore.
That's so crazy. I never knew that Green Day toured with them a year later.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and they did like a really memorable show. I think it's like I always screw this up, but I think they did some sort of like nativity play show, and Jail Cell played as well. So it's I don't know, like I love that. That's what I love about this scene is like it's so small, like you were saying earlier, but there's always cool, interesting people, and we're all weirdly connected through this thing.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
I have punished you for a very long time, and Porcell, I could punish you forever. Would you come back on the show at some point in the future?
Sure. No problem.
Before I let you go, because I ask everybody associated with this, because this has blown my mind, how did the Youth of Today T-shirt wind up in the New Kids on the Block video? Do you think?
It's funny because we were trying to get to the bottom of it too. We were thinking that maybe it was what was the name of one of the drummers for Warzone, EK.
EK played in a band with Jordan Knight beforehand, and I brought up this theory to Sammy, but Sammy was like, "No, I don't think it was EK because I think EK would have told me." Um, I think it was through Caroline, but I gotta get to the bottom of this somehow.
We were trying to figure it out for years, and we were thinking maybe it was through EK, but then we found out it wasn't through EK, and we just found out recently from somebody that it was a straight edge girl that loved New Kids on the Block, and she went on one of those cruises. And she asked them, "What was the deal with that Youth Today shirt? Were you guys into hardcore?" And they said, "No, we weren't into hardcore at all. Our stylist just gave us that shirt, and we didn't like we didn't even choose our clothes. Like the stylist would just give us these clothes, and she just gave me that shirt, and I had no idea what it even was."
Oh, that's the death of a dream. Because he did play in a punk band with EK, apparently.
Yeah,
Alien Boy, I think they're called.
one of them did, but it wasn't the guy that wore that shirt. Was it the
No,
guy?
I think it was Jordan that played in the band with them. So I don't know if Jordan's. I got to go back and rewatch. Gives me an excuse to go back and rewatch a New Kids video. Yeah,
He had no idea what the shirt was, and he had no idea who Youth Today was.
which is funny because I think Travis Scott recently wore a Judge shirt, and I wonder if he's got a Chung King original or something.
Yeah, well, that was another mystery we were trying to figure out.
I love when this stuff happens though because it's like it's like how does this thing happen? Like the America's Hardcore shirt in the beginning of Made. It's like oh, there's this whole like little story about how this wound up there.
Yeah, there was a weird. Who was that guy? Oh, Dax Shepard. Remember Dax Shepard?
Yes.
He had some show where he wore like a shelter shirt in one of the episodes.
And he talks about it, I think, too. Like someone asked him about it, and he's like, I was super. I love this band." And he might even mention Youth Today in that too.
Yeah, so he did a podcast with the guy, with the bass player for Blink 182, and they asked him about that Shelter shit, and he was like, "Yeah, I love Shelter. I was a huge Shelter fan." So when we heard that, somehow we got his address, and we sent him a bunch of Shelter long sleeves. He has some new ones now too. I think he's actually worn them. I think he put them on an Instagram. He wore one of the newer shirts.
Well, this has been amazing. And anytime you want to come back on and talk about New Kids on the Block or the Abused, you are always welcome.
All right, cool.